And one of those, it turns out those signals actually can synchronize the clocks in our body. The clock in the SCN is resistant to that. It doesn't really pay attention to when you eat or anything.
Hmm.
It's locked on to the light dark cycle. But for example, your liver and many digestive tissues, even your fat, are more strongly synchronized by the time of eating.
I guess
And
that makes some sense because right, your liver, a big part of what your liver does is it can store glycogen if
Mhm.
you're eating sufficient amounts of certain things. So it makes sense that an organ like that would respond to the timing of feeding. It makes sense that the SCN and the hypothalamus, which is hooked right into the retina, would really be paying attention to external light. And this gets us to the idea, I think, that there can actually be sort of multiple clocks in different tissues, and they might be active or inactive out of phase with each other, but there are mechanisms in the body that start to align these things depending on whether you eat at one time of day or another, relative to when you sleep, say.
right. Yeah. So, normally we're not changing time zones
Yeah.
or doing shift work. And so under normal circumstances, our brain clock is really controlling our behavior and sleep wake cycle. And then that drives our feeding behavior, which in turn keeps metabolism in sync with our brain.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to artificially change when you eat and say eat only at night when you're supposed to be sleeping, all your metabolic tissues actually are going to flip over and follow your eating time, and you will literally be uh, desynchronized. Your brain will be following the sun,
Mm-hmm.
but your liver will be following your feeding time. And so we call that internal desynchronization. Uh, and it turns out that being internally desynchronized is actually not optimal.
Hmm.
Um,
By
there
what
are other
that
ways of demonstrating.
Yeah, but that makes intuitive sense. But by what measures
Yeah.
can we see that directly?
Yeah. So in human studies, there are very nice controlled studies where they can um, desynchronize uh, sleep time, okay, from your internal clock, okay, and under and they do this artificially by putting the the test subjects on either a 20-hour day or a 28-hour day
Hmm.
for sleep. So you can, your sleep can follow that extreme period, but it turns out that your main clock can't go to 20 or 28 easily. And so it sort of maintains a 24-hour rhythm. And so what happens is your sleep wake cycle is scanning across. Okay, if it's 20 hours versus 24.
Right, right,
Okay.
right.
And so at some points you'll be in sync, but at other times you'll be out of sync,
Yep.
right?
So if you do this day by day by day, you'll have different days where things are in sync or out of sync to some different
That's
degree.
right. Yeah. And so what they found is, glucose regulation is impaired when you're out of sync. And also insulin levels are impaired. So a number of different endocrine measures
Hmm.
um, can be impaired. Those were the first ones discovered, but others have been found subsequently. So just sort of that subtle internal desynchronization already is pushing you to a pre-diabetic state, it turns out.
I see. So basically, what this implies is that if you have two people and everything is completely identical about them, except the timing of these things, this will lead to different metabolic health outcomes. They could be the same body weight, they could be genetically identical, they could eat the same number of calories, the same diet in terms of what nutrients and calories they're actually consuming. But if one of them is eating at a different time than the other, you would
Mhm.
expect to see, based on what you just told us, that all of these different parameters, or many of them, are actually going to be different, and one person will actually end up healthier than the other over time if one of them is persisting in this more desynchronized state.
That's correct. And so, it's hard to study long-term experiments in humans are these conditions, but we actually done this experiment in mice
Hmm.
and looked at longevity, how long they live under these conditions. And so the experiment's a little bit more complicated than just eating at the wrong time because we had different comparisons. We have mice that eat at the correct time, which is at night for them, and
Yep.
mice that eat at the wrong time, which is in the daytime when they're supposed to be sleeping. But then we also had a group that were fed continuously.
How does that
Um,
how did that work operationally?
yeah, so these mice are under caloric restriction,
Mm-hmm.
okay, because we're going into a different field here. Caloric restriction is really the most effective intervention for extending lifespan in model organisms. So, for example, in a mouse, if you reduce calories by 30%
Mm-hmm.
on average, the mouse will live 30% longer. It's a huge effect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, under those conditions, uh, the mice are hungry because they're 30% deprived
Yep.
on average. And so they eat as soon as we feed them, no matter what the pattern is.
I see. So you can just kind of plop food in there, and in that restricted state, they're going to wake up and eat it, even if
That's
it
right.
means waking up over and over and over again.
Right.